The airport buzzed with anticipation as travelers queued to board their flights. Among them stood Elijah Carter, a reserved teenage boy with dark skin, quietly holding a business-class ticket. Dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, fitted jeans, and a sleek black backpack slung over his shoulder, he looked composed, though his darting eyes betrayed a flicker of nervous energy. As Elijah moved closer to the boarding gate, a burst of laughter cut through the ambient noise. It came from Rachel Simmons, a flight attendant with a commanding voice and a confident posture, chatting breezily with a fellow crew member. Her sharp tone carried easily across the gate area, and her glances toward the boarding line were quick and appraising. When Elijah reached her, Rachel's expression faltered just slightly. Her eyes flicked from his sneakers to his calm, unreadable face. She adjusted her neck scarf with a practiced motion, her demeanor stiffening. "Ticket, please," she said, her tone clipped and cool. Elijah handed it over without hesitation, offering a polite, quiet smile. Rachel examined the seat number with raised brows. "Business class." Her lips tightened as if holding back a thought. She leaned a little closer. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah answered softly, pointing to the seat number printed clearly on the ticket. There was a pause, a moment of silent judgment, before Rachel gave him a tight-lipped smile and handed the ticket back. "All right," she said, stepping aside. "Just make sure you don't wander into first class. Stay in your assigned seat." Elijah nodded, his fingers tightening slightly on the strap of his backpack. As he walked past her, the sound of murmuring passengers and the shuffle of luggage surrounded him, but the sting of her tone stayed with him. He found his seat and quietly slid into the plush chair. Only when he was settled and had pulled a book from his bag did he finally let his shoulders relax. He flipped open to a bookmarked page, but couldn't focus. He could still feel Rachel's eyes on him. Eventually, she moved on, greeting the next passenger with her signature bright smile, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But something in her behavior felt off. The glance she cast back at Elijah was quick, but it spoke volumes. A quiet dismissal, a judgment not voiced, but clearly felt. Elijah kept his eyes on his book, pretending not to notice. Still, the chill of her reception lingered. He let out a quiet sigh and turned the page, reminding himself not to let it weigh him down. What Rachel didn't know, what no one knew just yet, was that her assumptions were about to be upended in a way she couldn't imagine. As more passengers filed into the cabin, wheeling carry-ons and exchanging small talk, Elijah sat silently, staring at the blurred words on the page. His thoughts replayed the moment at the gate, twisting in his mind. He shifted in his seat, glanced out the window, and tried to push it aside, but the tone of Rachel's voice clung stubbornly. Meanwhile, Rachel strode briskly through the aisle, her heels clicking on the cabin floor. Her posture remained perfect, her movements efficient, but her eyes flickered with irritation as she scanned the business-class seats. As she passed Elijah again, her gaze barely brushed him, but her lips drew into a thin, disapproving line. Just a few rows ahead, she stopped to assist a sharply dressed man in a tailored gray suit, helping him with his luggage. Her demeanor softened instantly, her voice turning pleasant, almost warm. Elijah noticed. From the corner of his eye, he caught the sudden shift in her tone. The contrast was unmistakable. He turned another page in his book, but the words refused to sink in. He wasn't unfamiliar with moments like these, where judgment came before understanding. He'd learned long ago how to carry himself with quiet strength. Moments like this weren't unfamiliar to Elijah Carter. Subtle jabs, quiet dismissals, the kind of treatment that left no bruise but still managed to sting. But he'd been raised to hold his head high, to rise above. He shifted slightly, the black backpack now tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of him, and tried to shake the tension from his shoulders. Soon, The low rumble of the engines signaled that takeoff was near. The hum vibrated beneath the cabin floor as Rachel Simmons re-entered the business class section, her steps practiced, her expression unreadable. She passed Elijah's row, pausing just a beat too long. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of a water bottle resting on his tray table. "That needs to be stowed for takeoff," she said abruptly, her tone devoid of the friendliness she'd used on other passengers. Elijah responded immediately with a polite nod, reaching to slide the bottle into the seat pocket. But before he could, Rachel reached out and snatched it from the table. "I'll take care of it," she muttered, her lips drawn tight as she shoved the bottle away without meeting his gaze. Then, without another word, she turned and moved on. A few passengers nearby exchanged glances. Their faces carried subtle frowns, part confusion, part discomfort. Across the aisle, an older woman who had been quietly watching the interactions gave Elijah a soft, empathetic smile. She said nothing, but the warmth in her expression was enough. Elijah offered a faint nod in return. He shifted in his seat once more, now feeling every second stretch out painfully. His fists clenched briefly, then relaxed as he exhaled deeply and tried to bring his focus back to the open book in his lap. At the front of the cabin, Rachel stood tall, her posture rigid and her composure seemingly intact. She resumed her pre-takeoff duties with cool efficiency, but every so often her eyes flicked back toward Elijah, just for a second, just long enough to reveal the judgment still simmering beneath the surface. She had no idea that others were watching, that her behavior, so routine to her, was beginning to stir quiet unrest among the passengers. What felt like just another shift in the sky was, in fact, shaping into something much more significant. 15 minutes after takeoff, Rachel reappeared with a tray of drinks, her smile carefully plastered in place. She offered warm greetings to passengers as she passed down the aisle, her tone light and effortless. But when she reached Elijah, that warmth evaporated. Without a word, she placed a cup of water on his tray table and walked away before he could respond, not even bothering to ask if he preferred something else. Elijah stared at the cup, his jaw tight. It wasn't about the drink. It was the message, the silence, the coldness, the way she treated him like he was invisible, an anomaly in a seat he didn't belong in. He took a slow breath, remembering something his father always told him. "Keep your dignity. Let their actions speak for themselves. Yours will speak louder." He sipped the water quietly and opened his notebook, pen in hand, hoping to distract his mind with words. But further down the aisle, Rachel had paused again, this time speaking warmly to a woman in pearls and a designer shawl. They exchanged a quick laugh, the kind of social ease Elijah hadn't been offered. He caught the interaction from the corner of his eye, a reminder that her kindness wasn't missing. It was simply reserved. Behind him, another passenger had taken notice. A man in a blazer leaned slightly toward his seatmate and whispered something. The other nodded subtly, both of them clearly recognizing the difference in how Elijah was being treated. Rachel moved past Elijah again on her way to the galley, her expression unreadable, until she caught sight of the same water bottle she had stuffed into the seat pocket earlier. It was sticking out slightly. She stopped suddenly and turned back toward him. "That's going to fall out if you leave it like that," she snapped, her voice sharp and unnecessarily loud. Startled, Elijah looked up from his notebook. "Oh, sorry," he said quietly, reaching to adjust it. Rachel let out an exasperated sigh and shook her head. "You need to be more careful." "We can't have spills in this section," she said, already walking away. This time, the reaction from nearby passengers was more visible. A few shifted in their seats, some glancing toward Elijah, others looking straight at Rachel's retreating back. The unease was no longer subtle, it was spreading. Elijah closed his notebook and set it gently on his lap. He took another breath and sat still, doing what he always did, holding the weight of moments like this with quiet grace. But something about this encounter was different. It wasn't just about her tone. It was the deeper implication, her assumption that he didn't belong, that he was, at best, out of place, at worst, a problem. Across the aisle, the same older woman who had smiled at him earlier leaned over just slightly. Her voice was soft, nearly a whisper, but full of kindness. "Don't let her rattle you, sweetheart." Elijah turned his head, offering her a grateful smile, small but genuine. "Thank you," he said. She returned to her book, and he turned back to his notebook, though the sting of Rachel's words lingered. Up front, Rachel moved with rigid efficiency, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the ripple of discomfort she had left behind. But soon that ripple would become something much stronger, something impossible to ignore. The older woman across the aisle leaned closer, her voice a gentle whisper wrapped in kindness. "Don't let her get to you, sweetheart," she said, her words carrying quiet encouragement. Elijah Carter lifted his eyes from the page, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. He offered her a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," he murmured, his tone calm, though edged with the weight of everything he was holding back. The tension in the cabin was becoming harder to ignore. Even Rachel Simmons, who had busied herself at the front of the plane, began moving with less ease. Her smile, still fixed in place, seemed stiffer now, as though it required more effort to maintain. She kept her head down, attending to small tasks, pretending not to notice the growing discomfort rippling through the business class section. She had no idea, none at all, that the quiet boy she had dismissed so casually wasn't just another teen, that the way she had treated him would soon take on far more meaning than she was ready to face. The steady hum of the engines filled the space between passengers like a low heartbeat. Elijah adjusted in his seat again, searching for a moment of comfort. The woman across the aisle gave him another reassuring glance before returning to her book, and Elijah turned back to his notebook, pen poised over the blank page. Writing usually calmed him. It helped him focus. But today the words wouldn't come. Rachel's voice, the clipped tone, the sharp instructions, echoed in his memory. His thoughts tangled. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing in slow and deep. Moments later, Rachel re-emerged from the galley with a tray of warm towels. Her smile was back, carefully curated. She began handing out towels to the front row passengers, her movements practiced. But when she reached Elijah, something changed. Her pace quickened. Her hand placed the towel in front of him without eye contact, her tone devoid of emotion. "Here," she said shortly, already moving on. "Thank you," Elijah replied, his voice steady, his manners unwavering. She didn't respond. Behind him, a man leaned forward slightly. He was older, dressed in business casual attire, and his voice was low but clear. "Some people just don't know how to treat others," he said gently. Elijah turned, surprised. The man offered him a small, understanding smile. "You're handling this better than most would," he added. Elijah gave a polite nod but remained quiet. He appreciated the support, even if he didn't know how to respond. Still, the growing awareness of Rachel's behavior only made him more uneasy. He hated being the center of attention, especially like this. He looked down, forcing himself to write something. Anything. Even if it was just to feel grounded again. Up near the galley, Rachel caught sight of the brief exchange between Elijah and the man behind him. Her brow twitched. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. She didn't like being talked about, not even in whispers, and she convinced herself, as she always did, that people simply misunderstood her intentions. After all, she was doing her job. Maintaining professionalism, keeping order. If that made her seem strict or unfriendly to a few passengers, so be it. but her movements grew stiffer as she busied herself organizing the meal cart. Just then, another flight attendant approached casually. "Everything all right in business?" she asked, balancing a stack of napkins in her arms. Rachel hesitated for half a beat. "Fine," she said flatly, then sighed, her voice lowering. "Some people just don't get how things work in this cabin, you know?" The other attendant raised an eyebrow, clearly picking up on Rachel's mood, but chose not to press. She gave a small nod and moved on. Back in his seat, Elijah glanced toward the front of the plane. The hum of the cabin had changed. People were speaking in hushed tones now, eyes occasionally drifting toward him. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could feel it, the subtle shift in atmosphere, like a storm quietly building. He closed his notebook, slid it into his backpack, and turned to the window, staring out at the endless blue sky. He needed the quiet. He needed something to feel still. But what he didn't know, and what Rachel Simmons certainly hadn't realized, was that nearly every move she made now was being watched. Not by airline management, but by the very people in the cabin, the ones who had noticed how she smiled at some and sneered at others. One row behind him, someone discreetly pulled out their phone, thumbs flying as they sent a message. Their eyes flicked between Rachel and Elijah. A current of anticipation ran through the cabin. No one could say exactly why, but something told them they hadn't seen the end of this yet, and neither had Rachel Simmons moved briskly through the cabin, her hands busy but her shoulders tense. She didn't catch the sidelong glances sent her way, nor the quiet murmurs drifting among the passengers like static. To her, this was still just another shift in the air, another day of customer service. But the cracks in her perfectly polished exterior had started to show. What Rachel didn't know, what none of the passengers could have predicted, was that the boy she had so quickly dismissed was no ordinary traveler. The truth hovered just out of reach, waiting to fall into her world like a storm breaking clear skies. The flight settled into a smooth rhythm, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly to signal the start of meal service. Rachel returned with the food cart, her face neutral, her hands moving with well-practiced precision. Her voice was smooth again as she smiled politely and offered meal choices to the front rows. "Chicken or vegetarian?" she asked cheerfully, the warmth in her tone restored. But when she arrived at Elijah Carter's row, the temperature shifted. She didn't bother asking him for his preference. Instead, she dropped a tray on his table with a short, indifferent, "Here." Elijah paused. He looked down at the tray, untouched. Then, quietly but firmly, he spoke. "Excuse me, I don't eat meat. Could I have the vegetarian option, please?" For a split second, Rachel froze. Her jaw clenched before she turned to him, the smile gone. "I asked earlier," she said curtly, though she hadn't said a word to him before. "You should have spoken up then." Elijah blinked, surprised by the lie, but stayed composed. "I'm sorry. I didn't hear you ask," he said, his voice level. With an exaggerated sigh, Rachel bent down to retrieve another tray. She handed it over with a little more force than necessary, the clatter of it drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. "There," she said coldly before moving on to the next row, her pleasant voice returning as if nothing had happened. Elijah stared at the tray for a long moment, his appetite drained, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of showing any distress. Instead, he calmly unfolded the napkin, placing it on his lap with deliberate care. Across the aisle, the older woman who had spoken to him earlier was watching again. This time, her lips were drawn into a tight line. She leaned over gently, her voice soft. "Don't let it get to you, dear. Some people, they just don't know how to respond to kindness." Rachel continued down the aisle, but her composure was beginning to unravel. She could feel the weight of the stares now. Passengers who had picked up on her changing tone, her selective courtesy. She didn't meet their eyes. Instead, she told herself it was nothing, that Elijah was simply overreacting, that some passengers were too sensitive. Back in the galley, she poured herself a quick cup of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she brought it to her lips. One of her fellow attendants noticed the tension. "You okay?" the woman asked, eyeing her carefully. "I'm fine," Rachel said too quickly, placing the cup down with a sharp clink. "Just a long day." The other attendant didn't press, but the energy around them had undeniably shifted. Out in the cabin, Elijah sat silently, his tray untouched. He watched the soft blur of clouds beyond the window. The blue sky reflected faintly in his eyes, but inside his thoughts were heavier. He tried to brush it off. He'd experienced moments like this before, being underestimated, misread, dismissed. But this time, something about it stayed under his skin. His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket, a reminder that the world beyond this plane was still waiting. But he didn't check it. Not yet. He leaned back in his seat, eyes closed for a moment as he let his father's voice echo in his mind. "You don't need to prove anything, son. You already know who you are." Meanwhile, Rachel remained oblivious to how close she was to the truth. In her mind, she'd handled the situation as any professional would, another routine flight, another challenging passenger. But her confidence, once steady, was beginning to slip. The discomfort in the cabin, the watchful eyes, the quiet disapproval, was growing louder than she cared to admit. And the storm that was quietly building? She was nowhere near ready for it. A quiet tension had settled into the cabin, like a thread pulling tighter with every passing minute. Passengers were falling into their routines, some watching movies, others dozing or flipping through books, but underneath it all, there was an unmistakable current of discomfort, a shift in the air that hadn't existed at the start of the flight. Rachel Simmons moved through the aisle with slightly quicker steps now, her posture still upright, her smile still present, but her movements had taken on an edge. She avoided making eye contact with the passengers who looked at her a second too long, their expressions unreadable but alert. In his seat, Elijah Carter noticed it all. The murmurs, the energy, the way people were beginning to glance his way, not with suspicion, but with recognition. He wasn't imagining it anymore. People had seen what had happened, and they weren't looking at him with judgment. They were looking at her. Up ahead, a man in a blazer turned and whispered something to his seatmate. 2 rows across, the older woman who had defended Elijah earlier fixed Rachel with a pointed look as she passed by, disapproval etched into the lines of her face. Rachel kept moving, ignoring the silent scrutiny. She told herself it was nothing, that she was being paranoid, that maybe she was just tired. She busied herself with meaningless tasks, straightening seatbelts no one was using, checking trays that didn't need checking. She glanced at her watch, sighing quietly. The rest of the flight stretched ahead like a long hallway with no end. In his seat, Elijah reached into his backpack and pulled out his wireless headphones. He slid them over his ears and let the music pour in, a soft, calming rhythm that helped drown out the noise around him. Music had always been his escape, a way to find peace when the world made too much noise. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the melody wash over him, but the heaviness in his chest remained. The stares, the whispers. It was all too familiar, and yet, this time, it felt like something bigger was coming. Something neither he nor Rachel could stop. At the front of the plane, a low buzz of conversation started to ripple through the first-class cabin. Rachel, organizing her cart near the galley, perked up slightly at the sound. She couldn't hear the full conversations, but fragments drifted her way. "He's here. I had no idea he was on this flight. So impressive." Rachel frowned, brushing off the chatter as just another round of celebrity gossip. It happened often enough up front. Probably some musician or tech investor on the cover of a magazine that week. She turned her attention back toward business class, her eyes briefly landing on Elijah. And still, something about him unsettled her. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd been respectful, quiet, even polite. But she couldn't shake the discomfort he stirred in her, not because of who he was, but because of what he revealed about her. He didn't fit the image she'd subconsciously built of what a business class passenger looked like. And that, she was beginning to realize, said more about her than about him. Just as she reached the galley again, a colleague approached with an intrigued expression. "Did you hear?" the woman asked, lowering her voice. "There's someone really important on board." Rachel raised an eyebrow, trying to appear unfazed. "Important how?" "Not sure exactly," her colleague replied. "I heard one of the passengers up front mention his name. Apparently he's a philanthropist, or a CEO, or both. One of those guys with influence everywhere." Rachel let out a half laugh, brushing it off. First-class passengers are always whispering about someone, probably just a tech bro with too much money and no real-world presence, but her colleague didn't look convinced. Maybe, but they said he's traveling with his son, and he's not sitting in first class. Rachel's smile faded slightly. Her mind flicked instantly to Elijah, and for just a second, a ripple of unease passed through her. It couldn't be him, could it? There were other kids in business class. This was probably just a coincidence, nothing to think too hard about. She pushed the thought away and nodded casually as her colleague walked off, but the strange, tight feeling in her stomach remained. Back in his seat, Elijah adjusted his headphones. He glanced at the time on his watch and shifted in his seat, trying to get comfortable. It wouldn't be long now. Soon the flight would land, and all of this would be behind him. But what he didn't realize, what Rachel Simmons hadn't even begun to imagine, was that the storm brewing inside the cabin wasn't done. In fact, it was just about to strike. The cabin had eased into a quiet rhythm. Passengers were absorbed in screens, books, or naps. But beneath the surface calm, there was something else, an invisible energy building like a current before a storm. Elijah Carter sat silently in his seat, headphones on, the soft music barely holding his mind. Though his eyes were closed, he was fully aware of the shift around him. The low whispers from the front cabin floated through the hum of the engine. Just fragments, but enough to stir curiosity among those nearby. There was an anticipation in the air, a sense that something was coming, something that hadn't quite shown its face yet. Rachel Simmons walked briskly through the business class aisle, trying to shake the unease from her earlier conversation. She focused on her tasks, but her eyes kept drifting to Elijah. She couldn't explain it. This strange pull toward him. He hadn't been rude or difficult. In fact, he'd been calm and composed the entire flight. And yet, something about him unsettled her. She told herself it was because he didn't quite fit. Too young, too reserved, too different from what she expected in business class. But beneath that, a quieter truth was whispering. One she wasn't ready to face. Up in the galley, the voices from first class had grown more excited, louder now, no longer just idle murmurs. "I saw his photo just last week. He's everywhere these days. I didn't expect him to be flying commercial at all." Rachel's pace slowed. Her brow furrowed as she tried to piece together the snippets. She glanced toward her colleague, who was stacking dessert trays, with a knowing smile. "Who are they talking about?" Rachel asked, her voice casually curious, but her pulse ticking faster beneath her uniform. "You seriously don't know?" Her colleague grinned. "It's Jonathan Carter, the tech billionaire who turned full-time philanthropist. Built an empire before he was 30, and now he's on the cover of every magazine with a cause." Rachel blinked. Now the name rang a bell. She remembered the headlines. the keynote speeches, that striking image of a man in a tailored suit standing in front of thousands, a visionary with quiet power and unmatched influence. "What's he doing on this flight?" she asked, trying to mask the surprise in her voice. "No idea," her colleague shrugged. "But first class is buzzing, and apparently he's not alone. He's traveling with his son." Rachel's stomach flipped. Her gaze flicked sharply toward Elijah's row. Her heart skipped. No, it couldn't be. There was no way the quiet boy she had brushed aside, the one she had treated with such coldness, could be his son. That was impossible. She gave a small, nervous laugh, shaking her head at herself. Coincidence. That's all it was. A few kids flew in business. It didn't mean anything, but she couldn't stop looking now. Her eyes fell on Elijah's backpack, the elegant stitching of a custom logo she hadn't noticed before, his posture, his calm, the quiet dignity in the way he sat, never asking for more than the space he was given. She replayed every exchange in her head, her clipped tone, the dismissive glances, the way she'd ignored his simple kindness. And then it happened. A figure stepped into the business class cabin from first class. Tall, commanding. His presence turned heads without him saying a word. The suit he wore was perfectly tailored, but it wasn't the clothes that caught Rachel's breath. It was the way he moved, with confidence, with authority, with ease. "Jonathan Carter." Rachel stood frozen as he approached. His presence filled the space like gravity itself. He stopped beside Elijah's seat, and the boy lifted his headphones. When he looked up, his entire expression shifted. Calm giving way to quiet pride. Relief. "Hey, son," Jonathan said softly, placing a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder. "How's the flight been?" Rachel's breath caught. It was him, Elijah, the boy she'd subtly patronized, the one she'd judged without a second thought. And he wasn't just anyone. He was the son of Jonathan Carter, the man the entire front cabin had been whispering about. The reality hit her like a cold gust of air, fast and undeniable. Her assumptions, her words, her tone, all of it exposed in an instant. Her heart pounded as the world she had carefully maintained began to unravel around her. And for the first time, Rachel Simmons didn't know what to do. There was no excuse she could offer, no words that would erase what had just unfolded in front of an entire cabin. The truth had been sitting just feet away from her the whole time, and now it was staring her straight in the face. Rachel Simmons stood frozen, her polished professionalism shattered in an instant. Her posture, once proud and composed, had slackened as the realization hit her like a bolt of electricity. Jonathan Carter stood tall and steady only a few feet away. His presence radiated the kind of calm authority that didn't demand respect. It simply commanded it. He leaned down slightly, his voice low and firm, laced with affection as he addressed his son. "You holding up okay, champ?" His hand rested gently on Elijah's shoulder, protective, grounding. Elijah nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "Yeah, Dad. It's been fine." There was something in his tone that lingered, a quiet resolve, a strength that echoed his father's poise. Around them, passengers sat motionless, the silence swelling into something electric. A few heads turned, some whispered, others discreetly lifted their phones, trying to capture the moment they'd just become part of, a celebrity sighting they hadn't expected. But the phones weren't pointed at Jonathan Carter alone. They were pointed at Elijah, too. And slowly, passengers began putting the pieces together. Rachel could feel it. Heat climbed up her neck as the recognition spread. Her actions, her tone, her dismissive glances, they were no longer private moments of prejudice. They were exposed. She tried to swallow the dryness in her throat, but the lump wouldn't move. Jonathan Carter straightened, his eyes sweeping across the cabin, and then, briefly, landing on her. His gaze was calm. He didn't scowl or glare. But something in his expression made Rachel's stomach twist. There was no mistaking it. He knew. He had seen her. He had read her. Rachel wanted to look away, to reach for a tray, a clipboard, anything that would give her an excuse to move. But she couldn't. She was paralyzed. It felt like the entire plane had gone silent. Across the aisle, the older woman who had been watching from the beginning turned toward Elijah, her voice warm and measured, just loud enough to carry. "Your father must be so proud of you." The words landed like a gentle declaration, but the timing made it feel deliberate, directed not just at Elijah, but at Rachel, too. Rachel's knees weakened. She forced herself to stand straighter. Her training told her to respond, to recover, to repair, but her instincts had deserted her. She took a shaky step forward and managed to speak. "Sir," she began, her voice soft and brittle, "it's truly an honor to have you on board. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let me know." Jonathan turned toward her slowly. His expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to see through every word. "Thank you," he said. His voice was civil, but there was no warmth, just a cool politeness, enough to be professional but unmistakably distant, as if to say, "I know what you're doing, and it's too late for that now." Rachel looked to Elijah. His face was composed, but his eyes held hers. He didn't look angry, just expectant, waiting for something she hadn't yet offered. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, and in that moment she realized she had no idea what to say. As Jonathan took the seat beside his son, Rachel retreated, almost stumbling, back into the galley. Her hands were trembling, her breathing uneven. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. The weight of it all had landed, her actions, her assumptions, her failure to treat someone with even the most basic respect. All of it had unfolded in front of not just her colleagues, but every passenger in business class. She had judged Elijah Carter the moment he stepped onto the plane, and now she was watching the consequences unfold, surrounded by whispers and sidelong glances. Passengers exchanged looks. Some whispered, others just stared. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely. There was no longer any doubt about what had happened. There was no going back. Rachel remained in the galley, her back to the cabin. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as she gripped the counter like a life raft. She glanced at the clock. Still hours to go, and with every passing minute, she dreaded the moment she would have to face them again. For now, all she could do was hide, and listen to the silence pressing down on her like the sky itself. Rachel Simmons stood alone in the galley, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts, excuses, rehearsed lines, fragments of apologies that all sounded hollow in her head. None of them felt right. None of them could undo what she had done. The full weight of it had settled on her chest like a lead blanket. She hadn't just embarrassed herself. She had insulted the son of one of the most powerful men in the world, and not with a single slip, but with a series of cold, dismissive gestures that now replayed in her memory with painful clarity. She peeked around the edge of the galley curtain and caught a glimpse of them, Jonathan Carter, sitting beside his son Elijah, the two locked in quiet conversation. Their heads leaned slightly toward each other. The father's posture was confident, dignified, but his gestures, small touches on Elijah's arm, the quiet way he listened, were filled with tenderness. The sight pierced something in Rachel. For the first time, she wondered what it must have felt like for Elijah. To sit through the entire flight, knowing exactly who he was, and yet choosing not to say a word, even as she dismissed him again and again. Outside the galley, the murmurs hadn't stopped. If anything, they were gaining momentum. Did you hear who he is? She treated him like he didn't even belong there. She must be mortified. The words were whispers, but they hit like stones. No one had said them to her directly. They didn't have to. She could feel the shift. The passengers had seen everything, and now they were putting the puzzle together far more clearly than she ever had. She inhaled sharply, then forced herself to act. With trembling hands, she poured a glass of water and stepped out into the aisle. Each step toward Elijah's row felt heavier than the last. The cabin felt impossibly long, and every eye seemed to follow her. She told herself to breathe, smile, say something gracious, repair the damage. But nothing could make the weight on her shoulders disappear. When she reached them, she cleared her throat softly. Elijah looked up first. His expression was calm, but unreadable. Jonathan Carter turned next, his eyes sharp and steady. Rachel felt her pulse skyrocket under the quiet power of his gaze. "I just wanted to check," she said, her voice unsteady, "if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." She held out the glass of water like a peace offering, unsure if it would be received as genuine or simply performative. Jonathan didn't respond right away. He looked briefly at Elijah, then back at her. "We're fine," he said, his tone polite but icy. There was no anger in his voice, but that somehow made it worse. It was the calmness, the restraint, that made it clear. He saw right through her. He knew exactly what she was trying to do. And it wasn't enough. Rachel hesitated, gripping the empty tray as if it might anchor her. She opened her mouth again, desperate to say more, but the words jammed in her throat. Then Elijah spoke. His voice was quiet, but resolute. "We're fine," he repeated, matching his father's tone, measured, composed, but unmistakably firm. There was no hostility, just dignity, and somehow that was even harder to face. Rachel realized in that moment that the apology she hadn't voiced would have meant very little, not because it wasn't needed, but because the damage had already been done, and any words now would ring hollow. She gave a stiff nod, her face burning, and turned back toward the galley. Her heart pounded as she set the tray down and leaned against the counter once again, this time letting the wave of regret wash over her fully. No more rehearsals, no more excuses. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. In the cabin, Elijah and his father resumed their quiet conversation as if nothing had happened. Their voices were low, their energy composed, but the silence around them said more than words ever could. The whispers had begun to fade, not into forgetfulness, but into respect. Something had shifted in the air, permanently, and for the first time